1, 2, 3. Good, good. Okay. Well, we're about to begin to, as we time our broadcast also for Facebook and YouTube, so we try to make it the same hour. And as people are not yet showing up, we'll start with an endgame of Magnus that he had against Mamedyarov. So a little more endgame practice for everyone here. Magnus is back to his winning ways after a record 21 straight draws. And he's tied for the lead in the Tata Steel tournament in Vacanze, Netherlands. He's tied with Nepomniachtchi and with Anand. So 49-year-old Anand is still at the top of the chess list. And a nice victory that Carlsen had against Rapport from Hungary, and also one or two of our Tuesday night marathon games. But we'll get in a little endgame practice too. So against Mamedyarov, Carlsen played rather dry opening, and he didn't get so much, but kept playing and playing, and they reached an unbalanced endgame where Mamedyarov had a rook and 5 pawns against bishop, knight, and 4 pawns. And instead of going through the whole game, we will just start at the position on move 42. So here, black has the 5 pawns, quite dangerous on the king side. He's got the rook very nicely placed on the second rank, which rook's on the c2. But white has this dangerous passed pawn on the a5. He proceeded pawn to a6, and it's ready to go to the finish line, but it's pretty easily stopped by the rook, so it can't advance, and the rook does a great job on the second rank. I'm sorry, the king is already on e5. And it's a little difficult for white to make progress. Meanwhile, the black pawns can still advance. Magnus played bishop to c6. So that's a very slow plan to take this pawn to move out of the way to advance the b pawn. And slow but very deadly if it occurs. And at this point, Mamedyarov needed to play very actively. He had to immediately advance his pawns and be very active with the king. So that he has sufficient counterplay with this e pawn, and king to c3, check, back, and if the pawn goes to a7, then he can keep checking with the rooks. Now, and he'd be able to make a draw. But that's a very good question here. This is a computer line, so I assume it's correct. King E1, King C3, Knight A4, check, King D4, A7, check, King E2, check.
If you ever play E2, you can, if the bishop takes the rook and take the knight.
I see a good move here.
Aha, okay, a suggestion. Maybe pawn to H5 here.
Thanks.
Now the threat is checkmate. If you block the checkmate, we can take the knight and stop the pawn from queen. Yeah, that's not so easy to find about 5 moves ahead. So someone as strong as a 2800 player, Mamajera, he should find that. But yes, to let this pawn get that close to queening, that's hard to do. And he played a safer line. He thought what you usually do is to get everybody to work on your side. And he simply advanced the H pawn so he can get 2 protected passed pawns there with the rook, which is very dangerous because it gives you checkmating ideas against the white king. But it's just one move too slow. Advance, trade, trade, and a nice move from Magnus to just question the rook. Where's it going to go? It's going to have to get off this second rank, which is a very annoying place. But it's also got to stop pawn to A7 and queen. So he did check, king to H2, pawn to F4, and now you're very afraid of getting checkmated with the white pieces. But this is where you have to be brave. And he simply did pawn to B5, calculating everything, and there's no checkmate there. If the king would go to F5, you're threatening pawn to G3 check, followed by rook checkmate, but you can upset the coordination of the black pieces with a check. The king comes here, knight takes the pawn check, and simply no checkmate. Well, also threatening checkmate, but
G3 or not?
yes, we either have to sacrifice the bishop or go G3 checkmate, or G3 check.
Takes, and then the knight takes the G3 pawn.
Ah, okay, very good. This is the simplest check. Pawn takes, knight takes, and rook A2 check would win the knight, except the bishop would take it. So
And then
these 2 passed pawns would simply win.
so if we had gone to B2 with the rook and then pushed the G3 pawn, that would be also something deadly.
Let us just finish with how the game continued and then go back to that question. Because he at least got one trick in, he advanced pawn to F4 and pawn to B5, sorry, pawn to B5, pawn to F3. Again, Magnus He didn't fear any ghosts. He just went pawn to b6, and then king to f4, again threatening pawn to g3 check, followed by rook h1 checkmate. Now if you go g3 check, well then these pawns are very dangerous. King to e3, and you're going to be able to give a perpetual check. So, with Magnus, simply it took away any chances after pawn to f3, king to f4 with, yeah. With knight takes e4. Right, oh, the bishop, sorry, the bishop's on the c4 square, but he just sacrifices the knight. And stopping the checkmate, he doesn't care if you take the knight, the 2 pawns on the 6 are simply going to queen. And you can threaten to go checkmate again, but the pawn queens would check. So that was a big victory for Magnus. He's up to the top of the tournament table. He's finally winning games. His rating's up to 2840. So back to his old self. And I think now we're going to try a game from the Tuesday night marathon. We'll get back to another game from Tata Steel, but we have so many entertaining games that we play right here. It's nice to take a look at some of them. And often these games, there's 300 or 400 rating points differential. So someone's playing way up and they've got to give it a good shot against a higher rated player. With white, we have our own Juan Zendejas, and black is Steve Gaffigan, one of the strongest players in the tournament. The game starts out with a Sicilian, and if you ever fear the Sicilian, it's nice to choose one of the alternative lines. Instead of the knight f3, d4 open Sicilian, you could try the very solid Alapin Sicilian. You could do a Spassky, the closed Sicilian with knight to c3 and pawn to g3. But very entertaining is the wing gambit, pawn to b4. And Juan had great success with this in Las Vegas, finishing 3rd in the Blitz tournament there. You just give up a wing pawn and then offer the a pawn in order to get quick development and control of the center. And if black takes the pawn, you can take with the bishop or the knight, and okay, you've lost 1 pawn here, but you get all sorts of play. Very entertaining. But naturally, some theoreticians took a look at this and they decided, well, we can make it safer for the black side, and the theoretical move is pawn to d5, countering in the center. And this is what Steve Gaffigan played. It's the best move in the position. And the usual move here is pawn takes d5. When black recaptures, and white should play knight to f3, which we'll get to in a moment. But I'll show you the shortest game that ever happened in the United States Chess Championship. That was International Master Kamran Shirazi with the white pieces against International Master Jack Peters, who had the black pieces. And Shirazi just took his pawn back on b4. Whereupon Peter thought for a couple minutes and said, you're not supposed to do that, and went queen to e5 check, winning the rook. And Shirazi just gave up. 5-move game. If you're wondering what you should play with the white side, simply, instead of recapturing right away, play knight to f3, holding the center, and after pawn to e5, then you can recapture on b4. The bishop can capture, but then knight to a3 gives you a lot of tricks on the white side. You're threatening, oftentimes, knight to b5, causing trouble of forks with the queen. The game Bronstein against Benko, actually from about 1950, continued bishop takes a3, bishop takes a3, and chances were about even here. White's got 2 bishops, some interesting diagonals, so fair play for the pawn.
Isn't it dangerous putting the rook in the game so soon in the game?
You mean allowing the white rook to...
Open file when bringing the rook in real quick, or...
Okay, but you're not going to get there so easily.
Oh.
It's like a lot of gambits where you get some play for a pawn.
Oh.
When you give up a pawn, you open a file. But black does have an extra pawn to take some control of the center. She'll probably play knight to c6, the other knight to e7, and just hold the fort. Some players don't like to play against gambits. Maybe you're one of them. Anyway, a very entertaining line that you might try from the white side. But Juan did a lot better than Kamran Shirazi, but he played an inferior line after pawn to d5 of recapturing on b4 right away. Pawn takes b4, and pawn takes e4 allows white more control of the center. Now, bishop b2 is a nice diagonal, but black can develop pretty solidly in the center. So bishop takes e5, bishop takes b4 is possible. The b5 holds some squares, so now black has a nice place to develop the bishop on c5, and if bishop takes e5, there's the check on f2 takes, and knight fork to get the piece back. So this version of the opening has gone in black's favor. Pawn to h3 takes the g4 square away. Castles, knight e2, and knight d7, guarding e5. Castles, knight b6 on the bishop, which retreats. Guards the e5 pawn. And black has more control of the center. So, developing and trading off one of white's active pieces. Queen e2, And now the black piece has become active. Knight to d5, headed towards the f4 square. So, black is getting, with the bishop, rook, knight, and on f4 square, black's getting quite a strong initiative here. Knight c3, attacks e4, but here bishop d4 prevents the knight on c3 from moving on to take on e4, and if you take with the other knight, queen takes e4, rook to g3, has a very strong threat on the g2 pawn. You can't go pawn to g3 because of the bishop pin, and black would just take it. So yes, we can go back to that variation that was before the knight came to c3, or the variation went knight to c3
Yeah,
here.
but if you don't do knight to c3, why can't you just take at that point? That's what I.
Yes, okay, that is a good move. We would go knight to f4 anyway.
Okay, then actually you could take the half better to get the queen in, which is not
You would take the knight with check here.
Yeah, but that is the queen, and I don't think I want that.
No, because you've got your.
Why not take the bishop?
Well, the queen is attacked from the knight on f4.
Okay, so you, okay, I got you, got the f4.
It is a very complicated position, lots of things happening, many things attacked.
Yeah, the queen could go there.
Queen could come here, that's true.
Actually, I would have preferred the rook on that side rather than the queen to start first.
Okay, but in any case,
Yeah, anyway,
black is getting a very strong attack here.
right.
There's really no way out of it at this point. It was very logical to develop the knight on b1, try to get some extra defense in there. And this gave white some chance after knight c3, knight f4, queen e1, bishop d4, rook to b1, so threatening to take the pawn with the knight on c3 and leave this one as a defender. Then Gaffigan played rook to c8, so if the knight moves, the c2 pawn drops. And probably this is black's last chance for a successful defense. You're in trouble anyway, but probably should take with the knight on c3 and lose the c2 pawn. But sometimes you just don't want to admit to quite a bad position. You're hoping for something better. And so you go into complications because neither player can quite see the end of them. Juan took on e4. Knight takes, and queen takes on e4 in order not to lose the c2 pawn. But the g2 pawn is a goner now. Pawn to g3, again we take it because of the bishop pin. Pawn to g4, well, you don't really want to play that. Queen h4, knight takes check. So you go for something complicated, maybe a little desperate, but take a pawn, hope you weather the storm over here. The black queen can't move because the rook has to be defended. Now, instead of taking the G pawn, Gaffigan decided, oh, there's another way to attack. Check, and knight takes F2. So, quite a strong attack. Really no defense, but G3 is the best way to hold up, stopping Queen H4. Okay, you're even in material. I'm sorry, you're actually one pawn down, but some hope here. And anyone want to guess the next move by black?
Rook to H6 check. Into G1, knight moves away with a discovered check.
You could check, yes, but then suddenly king on G2 is quite a safe square. And you're holding the fort there with control of the white squares. And you're threatening rook takes F2. You can't run away with the black queen because that's hanging. Well,
Rook takes G3, is that one?
pardon?
Rook takes G3.
Rook takes C3, let's go from there.
Okay, bravo. Taking the last defender away from the black king. And that one is a killer. You're threatening Queen H4 mate. And if you're calculating, king takes G3, Queen G5 check, there's just no way out. Such as king to F3, Queen G4 is checkmate.
And then the queen can't be
Yes,
Just check, she
if you
can
move, make sure it's checked when you move that queen.
And a checkmate to follow, so she doesn't have to come back.
Yes.
But it's good to take the rook either way.
Okay, all right, that's even better. And Juan tried to take the rook on C8, deflecting the queen. And it didn't help quite enough because after takes, the queen is coming to H3 anyway. So Juan, apologize, my apologies for showing your game, but it was a very entertaining game with lots of good tactics in it. And I loved your wing gambit as a choice of opening.
Thanks.
So we will move back to Tata Steel and then maybe come back for another game from the Tuesday Night Marathon. But we'll show Magnus back in good form. When I see him make all those draws, then well, I'm just not as big a fan anymore. But when he plays his aggressive attacking chess, then it's superb. So black in this game is Richard Rapport from Hungary, about a 2750 player. Magnus has white, and back to E4. Really no more funny openings, just going straight for the aggressive play. And a Sicilian defense, which Caruana doesn't play unless he's a bit desperate to win, yes. Because Caruana would do the Petrov defense and you get a very stodgy game. But a Sicilian means lots of action. And a nice open Sicilian at that. Rapport chooses the Taimanov variation. It's a little more strategic and positional than the Najdorf variation or Dragon variation. Then Magnus chooses a kind of a slow build-up with pawn to G3. just develop the king side and castle where you're safe. And the game doesn't have immediate tactics. On D6, back in the old days, Fisher against Taimanov. Taimanov would take the knight, attack the queen. Fisher countered with bishop to f4, and he won a very famous game with a beautiful endgame in it in the match they played in 1971. But rapport simply transposes into a Tycho-Scheveningen, and the slow build-up continues. Now, a pretty interesting plan. The immediate exchange of knights strengthens the black center. So the black pawns can be very strong with pawn to d5. But this nice plan, knight to a4, because you're going to use the c pawn to keep control over the center squares. b8, pawn to c4. And he immediately plays pawn to c5. Not sure he had to do that right away. But both sides develop. And black has the extra pawn in the center, but it's restrained. Very hard to advance one of the black pawns. So they're defensive back here. And how does white advance? You can do pawn to f4, something, queen to d2. But Magnus chooses a kind of curious move, queen to e1. Maybe you could already play pawn to e5.
Is that against knight d7 to e? Maybe, okay.
Well, the main reason is maybe you have the option of pawn to e5 right away. And
The knight
Ford did
d7.
play knight d7 to prevent it.
Oh, okay. Do you play f4? Oh.
That is his plan, but first develop all your pieces. The rook certainly doing something on the D line. And bishop b7. And now Magnus teases him a little bit. A threat of checkmate, or stops it. A threat to the D pawn. He just goes back to defend it. And it's again. Queen to c3. Back. Queen d2, bishop e7. So I guess gaining some time on the clock. But now he advances pawn to f4. Just a little more space, a little more control for white. So now the poet plays pawn to e5, blocking the diagonal. And right, you're thinking, oh, the play's going to be over there, but white first takes some control of these queenside squares, so black rook can't go to d8 without getting skewered. Bishop on the knight, but bishop a5. Queen b7, and the knight comes back to an excellent square. holding e4, looking in on the d5 square.
So I guess the question I have is like, why did black, I thought they were going to be fighting over d5, but it looks like black is just giving that square up. Any idea why?
Well, he does have complete control over the d4 square if he could get it.
Okay.
Um,
So I guess it's double edge, maybe? I don't know.
yes, but if you look at it, white's pieces make sense. You know, this knight can jump in, the bishop's good. It's not quite as good coordination from the black side.
Yeah,
So you're right, it has gone a bit wrong for black.
yeah.
I don't like bishop b7. Okay.
Okay, but it's an advantage, not winning yet, not. There's, he now captures on f4. Takes and rook to e8. So maybe the e-pawn will come under fire. Yes, maybe you could get the bishop to f6 and d4 check. Some ideas for the black side.
Knight to f8 to e6 to e4.
Okay, you give black time. Those are excellent plans, and black could get the advantage also. You know, this is on a good square, good diagonal. But here is where you don't allow your opponent to achieve his plans, and you cross them up with something. This is a superb move from Magnus, charging in the center right now. Now, you can't take on e5 because of bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, and the knight hangs on d7.
Yeah, that's wrong.
So you're not losing a pawn that way. However, he takes first on g2, queen takes on g2, and then pawn takes e5, because if queen takes queen on b7, the rook recaptures guarding the knight on d7. You have given up a pawn for the white side. But this would probably make you feel better. Such a beautiful knight in the center. That's like it's worth a rook. And you can see how all the white pieces are getting to excellent squares. This bishop's going to return to c3 on that long diagonal. So black is in a bit of trouble here.
Could they just go black queen against that queen down there? Can we move?
You want to go back a move?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, it was here, this was here.
And now queen against queen,
Queen against queen,
king there.
takes.
And now pawn,
You can't take now
I
because
see, I got
the
it.
rook wins
Yeah,
the
yeah,
knight.
I see, okay, yeah, yeah.
You're right, you're in an endgame, but it's a wonderful endgame for white. All the white pieces are jumping to
Yeah.
terrific squares. Now, so the play was pawn takes e5 immediately, winning a pawn, but knight to d5, threats of like bishop to c7 and such. Rapport plays pawn to e4, and bishop back to c3, threatening mate. And pawn to f6 holds the squares on the king side. So not so easy to break through here. Suppose you could take, but you give up your initiative. You might move the rook here. This is a very nice plan for white though. This rook on d1 is very active, the bishop on c3, knight on d5 doing a lot. Magnus moves the king to h1 so he can take the g file, just adding to the pressure. I think white had a couple of different options, but this is a very good plan. Bishop f8 and I'm sorry, it was king to h8 first, rook g1, then bishop f8 to guard that. And you could actually get away with knight takes f6, but I like what he did is building the pressure.
How would you defend against knight takes f6? Oh, the knight is
Yes, you would win the pawn back. Knight takes f6, and knight takes f6, and bishop takes. You cannot take the bishop because of checkmate.
So push the pawn.
Could push the pawn, yes. Something probably good for white, trade queens, bishop e5, but it's not checkmate. So instead of cashing in, getting your pawn back, knight e3 stops the pawn, can hop up, and this rook can also come into play. Queen c6, went rook to d5, that's headed to the king side. Poor tries to get the queen over there. Rook h5, queen f7, queen h3, and take a look at all these white pieces. Two rooks on the h file, rook on the g file, bishop on the long diagonal, this knight ready to hop in, and you're feeling pretty good now.
H6.
Well, h6, then you're all on the black squares, maybe knight to f5 and sacrifice. He played g6 because that guards the h7 pawn, attacks the rook, forces the rook on h5 to move. And for a moment you feel good that you've defended things. But Magnus simply backed up, and he's got various ideas for crashing through. Rook b6, about as good as anything to get more defense on this rank, the f6 pawn. Anyone want to suggest the next move for white? Knight back to d5, certainly a good move. That's that was his choice. So now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 attacking pieces. And pawn to g5 simply doesn't work because it's pinned. The rook would take it, and then you're going to triple on the e file. So Rapport jumps in with the knight to e5, holding off the bishop, trying to cover the king side squares. And now it's knight to d5. Rook came to d6. And pawn takes on g6. He's entering the final combination, which you all are going to figure out. Knight takes g6. So I'll stop here because this is the hard part. We'll make another move if you don't want to get too tired before your games, but anyone want to suggest Magnus's move here?
Oh, I would just take
Bishop
Knight takes pawn.
F6 check.
Just knight takes on, F6.
Probably you could do that, and rook takes, and,
And
he
then
did
you've
do,
got, then you got rook against the queen, and then the rook on the fine.
yeah, knight takes, rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes, rook
Right.
check, king to g8. Yeah, it's, few checks might come, but, yeah, in fact, the computer says that's winning also.
Okay.
But he played
What a big one.
bishop f6, check. And, okay, king g8, rook takes, and you either win the queen or do a checkmate. So he did rook takes f6, and now, rook takes pawn.
What H7?
Okay, very nice, just an absolute finishing off. Rook takes h7, check.
Right. The two rooks are gone.
Doing everything with check, with tempo. Queen takes, queen takes, king takes, knight f6, and winning the rook on e8, so Poor just gave up. So, you know, that was a tour de force. Magnus was just back in his best form, and nice to see. That tournament is turning out to be quite entertaining now. I'm going to show you an endgame that occurred in, it was again this round. There was Rajabov, who was from Azerbaijan, up near the lead, trying to win a game against Ferodsev, and he overpressed. So he reached a position where he was a pawn down in a rook ending. And he got to a position where he had some play for the pawn. And he was just about holding on. I can find my paper here. Well, okay, I remember this. So, black one pawn up, but the white rook is active, and black played king to c5. He's holding this pawn. He's wanting to get his king over and get two protected passed pawns. And white played check, so that in order not to lose the rook, rook to c6. Question is, you can trade the rooks, you're a pawn down, but the white king is very fast here. So can you win the game with the white side? And let's make it a little simpler to visualize. Check, takes, king f6. What's happening here?
So he's going to take a G pawn, go to G7, and pop the pawn down.
Okay, it's black's move at this point.
B5.
b5 to get a pass pawn over here. We take with check, which is important, so that you can't just run here. We need to get an extra tempo to queen rf pawn, taking on g6 and pushing up. Endgames are very tricky, and they'll decide, you see players that they get in trouble, get into an endgame and win, or a game like this, if you can just get the right plan, you'll win instead of draw. So this has been right so far, but what does black do?
King D6.
Bravo. You don't take on b5 because here, and you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's simply a queen ending, which is a draw. But you leave that advanced pawn on b5, king to d6. That wins you the critical tempo. And you look around as white, wondering what you can do. Now it doesn't work to take the pawn on g6. If we count, push, almost there,
Yeah.
but we don't make it.
Check.
And the pawn
Oh.
queens with check. So the main variation doesn't work, and
So why is white's B pawn not giving the black in the box?
what's that?
Isn't that black B pawn also gonna run?
Yes, it looks, visually it looks like it has to work for the white side, but
So what about?
push, but then what do we do? If we push here, we're still in the box, and now
Gain
we've
another
used
tempo.
2 tempo.
Now take and then drop the.
Yeah, you take, but now you're simply too slow on the king side.
3 versus 4.
Push. Queen, you can get 2 pawns to the 7th, but that simply doesn't work against a queen.
Yeah.
Such as, easiest move would be stop all the pawns from queening.
Yeah.
Take this. Game over. So, in fact, after the king d6 move in that game, Rajava sat there, thought for a while, and just resigned. Realized there was no way to save it. Our own Sam Shanklin is there. He's playing a tournament with all the major players of the world. He's got -1, so he's right in the middle of it. In last place is still Vladimir Kramnik, who's maybe the first last place in his life. But he's just out of form. We have a little more time, so I had one other Tuesday night marathon game that was very entertaining. No, not that they all aren't entertaining, but I can't show them all. In the first rounds, you get these great rating disparities, but you all seem to handle that pretty well. Seems like you don't mind playing someone 300 or 400 points up or 300 points down, and the games are all real struggles. Sometimes the first round is a bit much on some of the boards, but only the first round. And this was just Jerry Simpkins, aka the Great One, against Daniel McKellar. And Jerry is known for his original openings. There's another way to play against the Sicilian. D5 is a good response. You could take it, or E5 is Jerry's done. black gets a comfortable game in the opening, but, right, you're just in a different kind of position. D4 is good. F6. And it goes a little bit wrong for white, but pawn takes, pawn takes. So black is seems to be winning the pawn on e5. Queen b6, or excuse me, queen a5 check first. Queen b6, rook to b1, and black wins a pawn. But there's pawn on e6 is a bit backward, so a little bit of play. And often in these games you get down, you get in a bit of trouble, but you just have to fight back. Bishop f4, guarding the d3 pawn. Queen h5. And Daniel castles one. Bishop g5. So bishop e7, maybe you could trap that bishop. So he plays knight to e7. Queen back e6. Knight. Pawn to e5. And black is better with careful play. But it's not so easy, and I like that it's going to be castling on opposite wings. Knight b5. So just to say the ratings, Jerry is 1508, Daniel 1872. Okay, quite a bit difference in rating, but what a great position. You know, action all over the board, lots of things happening. Neither king's going to be very safe. Now this one is a bit dubious. Bishop e7, I might have gone back. And here he could have sacrificed exchange and gotten a tremendous pin here. And this should have won the game. Rook, takes, queen e4, and you win this because the knight doesn't have a square. Rook f1 check doesn't win the bishop because the bishop can capture here. So there we would have gotten a great upset. But as in all these sports, sometimes you have to be a little lucky. And Jerry didn't do that exchange sacrifice. Queen's on e2, thank you. Yes, so he went a4, which is a bit slow. Bishop d7, b4, rook takes check. King takes so that this rook is still guarding. Queen checks. King trades. Pawn takes. Bishop takes. Bishop takes. Rook takes. still a completely unbalanced position, since this bishop is good, these pawns can advance, but black has the extra pawn. F8, rook A4, trying to crash through, queen to B6, doubling, queen A3, and A6 to hold it, but things are happening. Pawn to C5 is a break, queen takes B5, we're going to win on B7, but Daniel very nicely charges back to the king side here, threatening queen checks and there. And now Jerry should have retreated with queen A1, and still he's got good play. Something like check. The white king is safe, and you're getting many checks on this side of the board. But here it was very close. He first guarded the check, but queen to G5. I'm sorry, the rook is here. There was actually A5 first. Yes, but it was in this position of bishop to E4, which looks like it's giving the king space, and that was the blunder for, unfortunately, the mate in 2. So, great battle and almost a big upset by the great one. But I love seeing these, hope to see them more. And I'll let you go now with 10 minutes before the round.